Hello and welcome to Vassar Campfire Stories, a podcast where we listen to students talk about their spooky experiences on Vassar College's campus and how that experience changes the land of the living. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Vassar Campfire Stories. This is actually our final episode for this series. I am your host, Haley Bax, and I am delighted to be sitting here with my guest, Tommy. Tommy, would you like to introduce yourself to our lovely listeners?
Hi, I'm Tommy. I am a senior, class of 2021, art history and Japanese double major.
Well, thank you for being here today. And without further suspense, let's get right on into it.
So, my whole experience with the supernatural started when I was fairly young. I was about 3 or 4 when I had a respiratory virus and I was put into a hospital. And it was like an experience where I was not expected to live. I was out for a good like 2 to 3 days. But then my grandma on my dad's side, she apparently went to a like Buddhist temple without telling anyone. She sold my soul to a some form of spirit in exchange for me to like be healed, lots of spiritual magic sort of stuff. Then like ever since I was again like 4, I've been able to like see things. I had very, very bad bouts of sleep paralysis for a good 11 years after. Then I had a period where it stopped until I got to college. And then I had sleep paralysis again. Fun things to wake up, you're in your room with your roommate and you see something in the corner and you're just like, I can't scream because I'll wake my roommate up. So yeah, I have been able to see things since that young age, usually at night, because also like nighttime, typically you're not doing anything, so your mind's at rest. I guess for those who don't know Vassar campus like our listeners, there is this golf course that's surrounded by the woods, like on the east end of campus. And it is so lovely to walk around at night. Like there's no lights, there's lots of stars and really good like moonlight. And it's very pretty, very serene. And yeah, so there's like these woods and they are tall. They're like, you think they're not that big because it's like, oh, it's campus. There's like houses somewhere on the other side of them. But then you like approach the trees and it just gets taller and taller. And it's sort of like this wall of woods encasing this golf course. And I'm not sure if you've seen Princess Mononoke. I assume a lot of people have. That's what it sort of reminds me of. Like there's spirits in the woods in that movie, and there's definitely spirits here at Vassar, like in those woods. Not sure what kind of spirits exactly, but they're definitely more like forest spirits.
Up and down the Hudson.
One place I took the train from California to Vassar, um, which is one very beautiful. Going through the desert and everything, it's a like the stars are awe-inspiring. But there's like a tract of land like that the train just runs through, and it's like more through like the Great Plains, like Corn Belt sort of area. And it's hard to describe this feeling, but it's sort of like a oppressive anger and sadness that just sort of washed over me as soon as I looked out the window. I like had tears welling up in my eyes, and it's a similar sort of feeling, but because like here at Vassar, I've lived here for so long, I became more accustomed to that feeling from our neck of the woods rather than this huge span of land that has a very similar just energy running through it, and people are forgotten, and that's the really sad thing. It's hard to acknowledge like sort of the pain and everything that like you can sense around in this area, and just know that like it's almost impossible to reconcile them except just acknowledgement, and not necessarily rewriting history because we already rewrote it. We're still trying to like unearth the actual history and all that. So it's like a interesting thing to dwell on, I believe, especially when we're talking about ghost stories here at Vassar. Speaking of other supernatural things in the woods, so there's that path between like one of the dorms and the street, and it's like sort of surrounded by trees, you know?
Yeah, the path between Joss and the street to our little town of Arlington.
Yes, exactly. So one like snowy night, I was walking over there. So
anyone at Vassar knows that that street is rarely empty.
yeah. And like I so I'm looking like straight in that direction where I saw all this movement, and there's just something darting through the trees, like big, not like there's deer on this campus, but it's like bigger than the deer, did not move like a deer, and it was just running. So I'm like, I'm like scared shitless because that's not normal. So I'm like looking at this, completely terrified. And then 1 second, I'm just like tracking with my eyes. And then it's completely gone behind the trees. Like no movement, nothing. Like there's a clear break where it could have gone into the street, but nothing was moving. It just disappeared in that point blank moment. And then seconds later, a car drove by. So it sort of felt like that's like a weird instance of the case where like reality slipped for that moment, and then somehow I got back. And it's a really terrifying thing because I don't know what that was. I'm not sure how else to describe it because I didn't get a good view of it. Like it just was gone, and to this day I don't use that path walking anymore. At least alone. I avoid it completely. I like walk along the street, or I find another way to get to the little town of Arlington that's aside from the path, because that's sort of like a really weird moment. It's a moment that I feel like I would not want to attempt to recreate, you
Right.
know? Like because I personally believe like a lot of those like superstitions and like worries about demons that you see, I always think there's something very real behind it. Like there's like so many instances in like across like different cultures where you see like this one period in time, like the witching hour, which is like midnight to like 3 a.m. usually. And it's sort of like such a interesting like global phenomenon, and it's sort of haunting. You're like, oh, what happened here? But yeah, for some reason those kinds of things happen to me at 8 p.m. on a street with some lights and you know, shared experiences. Yeah.
Well, thank you for your stories. They're really great and really eye-opening, and I love that you brought up the fact that ghost stories, they can hurt people, and I want to acknowledge that, but they can also help remember, especially people that might not be necessarily in the history books. They might help you remember regular people, and that's really kind of what my goal is here, is to maybe remember the people that used to reside on Vassar's campus in some form. So I appreciate you bringing that up. This is kind of about Vassar's relationship with the supernatural and how it affects its students. So I was wondering how these experiences affected your feeling of Vassar, the feelings of the woods. You kind of already talked about how you avoid that path going to Arlington, but how did it affect you when you started to feel these things?
When I started to feel these things, it was mostly not necessarily like orientation week, because orientation week, it's a days. Like that entire like first month of freshman year, you're still acclimating. So anything supernatural that may have happened to me then, like any of the callings, I shut them out because I was too nervous trying to like just adjust to college life. I feel like going on and sort of like once I found my footing on campus, then I started to sense these things more. Like I started to grow more aware. It sort of made itself known more, like oddly enough, in October, which is like the second month that school's usually in. And then it didn't grow. I feel like once you first notice something, that's when it's like strongest.
Mm-hmm.
That's when you see the most of it or tend to notice the most of it. Then you're sort of normalizing it afterwards. Like, I still go on walks in the middle of the night towards the golf course, towards this giant wall of forest, because I'm acclimated to it. Those spirits that I notice are probably acclimated to myself. Like, sure, there might be some like call to the woods that I still sense, but it's less of a giant, like, I guess a trumpet blaring in your face and more of just like, oh, background music that you tend to notice. Like that very like gentle like music score across scenes. That's sort of what it becomes.
Like, did you feel more at home at Vassar with these things calling to you? How did it make you feel about the campus and the space?
I guess I do feel at home at Vassar, like just because I'm like nearing the end of my years at Vassar. So then like I'm probably at this point in time the most acclimated I can be with them. Looking at how it feels now, I would say I'm at home with it. But definitely thinking about initially, it's like throwing a kid in a pool of ice, just the immediate shock.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, when you're thrown into cold water instead of like trying to like tiptoe into it, you then get acclimated faster.
So initially, when you were experiencing these things, it was a bit of a shock and not a pleasant one. But I mean,
Yeah.
you said that you still go on walks near the woods, so it
Mhm.
seems to not really bother you anymore.
That is correct. It's just something that definitely is in the back of my mind. Like, oh right, there's those woods. Like I see them, and every time I sort of want to get closer, like I'm sort of thinking maybe I shouldn't just in case because of mostly that one experience, but also just other paranormal experiences I've had in my life.
So would you say that Vassar has more positive energies around it?
I think positive to like or like a more neutral stance, like sort of leaning towards the positive end of a spectrum, but it's definitely feels more neutral, at least at this point, from what like in the recent months that I've walked around the woods, it feels a lot more neutral, just like something of like that's just like sort of living and breathing, like it just goes like that.
So the other question I had was you said that your sleep paralysis stopped and then you came to Vassar and it started again. And do you have any theories about why that may have happened?
I do have my own theories, mostly because like when I've had sleep paralysis, I feel like when most people have had sleep paralysis and have connected it to being more like a supernatural occurrence, they start to connect the dots that it's not exactly a positive or kind thing that happens.
Mhm.
So, I lived in Raymond House for my first 2 years, and those 2 years I did experience sleep paralysis very much so. I always woke up at 3 a.m. Like almost every bout of sleep paralysis I've had since childhood occurred around 3 a.m. And like there's some vivid sensations that I remember. It was definitely more akin to an actual like haunting rather than like say literally the me walking in the woods and hearing things call to me. That feels natural. That is like neutral, loving forest spirits. They just want their home at peace. But this was like something very different. And I don't personally know the history of Raymond House, but old things collect things. Old things tend to, I feel like, collect more energy just because there's love and hate that sort of just cycles through them. And so my theory is like my sleep paralysis acted up during those first 2 years just because of where I was. I wasn't completely acclimated.
Mhm.
So I think one, not only my own personal like psychology was affecting that, but there's always that saying of the energy you put out attracts similar energy. And definitely with the supernatural and what I've experienced growing up, that is very true for attracting, said haunting, said negative spirits. That's at least my theory on why my sleep paralysis came back.
All right, so we have woods that call to you, a strange creature that runs across the path to Joss and disappears into the street, and negative energies, maybe, in Raymond House. Well, I am glad that you have become acclimated, and it sounds like you and the spirits have gotten used to each other.
I would just like to thank you for having me on here as a guest.
Absolutely. So, thank you so much. Tommy's stories are particularly interesting because they're not tied to a building, but rather a landscape. The woods around Vassar hold an energy that Tommy can sense, and while most of the spirits are nice and peaceful, some have more negative energies. His aversion to the path to Arlington speaks to the more negative elements of Vassar's past, and the influence that can have on students. Vassar's difficult history is not a surprise, and the land holds the stories of the people that used to be here even before Vassar was founded. Beyond the buildings and infrastructure surrounding the creation of Vassar, the landscape itself holds a history and is haunted by its past. We cannot forget the stories that were erased and hidden by colonialism and the institution of Vassar. These stories help us to remember the people of the past and find a greater connection to the areas we inhabit. They also help remind us of the histories some would rather have forgotten. Be aware of the hauntings around you and remember those that came before. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the Vassar ghost stories. I'll let the campfire go out for now, and I hope that you do have a very good night.